Times are changing, we might be at risk of losing something, and I think that might be why Ashes of Creation is something people really want. So, does this look like an MMO to you? How about this? Or this? Hell, this is a bit out there, but what about this game? Well, apparently they're all considered MMOs. And which of these do you play? In fact, what parts of these games actually matter to you? Because spoiler, the whole thing's changed. Soulframe is a new MMORPG, recently announced with an evocative cinematic that promises a beautiful fantasy world, and one that's definitely very different to the existing MMO lineup. People are pumped as hell about it, despite it being super early. And rightfully so. It comes from a renowned developer who's been running a game, mostly successfully, for over 9 years. The clue is in the title. It's the people behind Warframe, Digital Extremes. The weird part is that it seems like a departure. Warframe itself is hardly an MMO. It's mostly a hallway murder sim with an insanely grindy loot loop. Or is it? For the first 4 years, it was solely a lobby-based instanced game, but then they made big instances, landscapes, that support up to 50 players, and generally they had more and more open-world content added, but for the most part, it's a small group content game at its core with some player hubs. Maybe it's earned the MMO subtag, but it's still a far cry from what you would expect of that label given the past. And that sparked a question that we should explore. What defines an MMO? We could argue about the literal definition of massively multiplayer online or role-playing game, but that boils down to semantics, and let's be real, we all know the term RPG has been just about ruined over the last 20 years. So what we really have to deal with is reality. r/MMORPG, as an example, has this list of MMO subreddits. These are MMOs. I think we can all agree in that. But it also has a list of MMO likes, which they explain as having MMO-like qualities, whatever that means, and they even point out that when the sub voted, 60% thought that Destiny was an MMO. There are a lot of players playing. Even though you can only play with a few at a time, you can see plenty in the world, and it's got numbers in it that I guess you grind to go up. MMORPG it is. Even Anthem would debatably fall under the same category, but almost nobody called it one, and if Destiny is an MMORPG, then surely so too is Warframe. But that puts these games at odds with classic MMOs, Dark Age of Camelot, EverQuest, WoW, Guild Wars 2, EVE, RuneScape, ESO. Classic MMO being largely indicated by being set in a shared world and players going about their business alone or in groups, but either way, they were always interacting with each other. You could have a conversation. You could go on quests together, trade items, duel, the works. The massively multiplayer part didn't come from the player count, but a vibe that you could do this with everyone. Basically like showing up to a town and seeing a whole bunch of people with different roles in life. Some you may recognize from before, some you might be inspired by because of whatever title or items they have, and then a healthy dose of strangers who may just be friends that you haven't met yet. They were focused often on being sandboxes with just enough toys for players to be able to build their very own virtual lives. But as focusing on gameplay systems got more important for developers, for a vast number of reasons, content started to become king over building a good sandbox where really the players via their interactions build the content themselves. So the prospect of a theme park MMO came to power, and we woke up one day and realized that the MMO market looked substantially different. Could you say that the Destiny-like experiences are just theme park MMOs with the inefficient bits polished out? Who knows? As action, combat, and tight progression loops became more and more prevalent, the staples of sandboxes and player interaction kind of sprouted up elsewhere in new forms. Because now if you want a social sandbox, you'd go and play a less massive survival game like DayZ, Rust, or H1Z1, or something old like OSRS. As Andrew Ross wrote for Engadget in an article calling the genre survival MMOs, quote, "I love MMOs, but recent theme parks and building games have left me wanting something a bit more dangerous, but still not a pointless murder fest." To him, the MMO had lost its teeth, that sense of danger and realness that World PvP brought, and people definitely love that short-term social cooperation or antagonism that survival games bring. You can have some of the most fantastic and unique stories as a result of their sandboxes. Sure, their type of quest doesn't have the same D&D-like flavor of some of the MMOs, but it is quite a similar experience in many ways. MMO became an umbrella term for whatever had servers and players, but it stopped communicating really anything else. Even Final Fantasy XIV had to fight off some of the MMO assumptions when it came to story. When Shadowbringers was being called the best JRPG story in a decade, it notably had the caveat, yes, we know it's an MMO, but seriously, we mean it. To get to the actual game that sparked this video, though, will Soulframe itself actually be an MMO? Well, according to the developers, it's a free-to-play open-world adventure that is heavily influenced by themes of nature, restoration, and exploration. It's focused on melee compared to Warframe's shooting, and it's going to be slow and heavy instead of crazy high speed. It's also going to share Warframe's focus on co-op PvE, and in fact, here's a quote, "It still has a lot of similarities to the genre they have experience in, but a greater focus on exploration." So it certainly seems like it'll be more of an MMO than Warframe, but whether or not that exploration means spending hundreds of hours in a shared world like old school MMOs, or just doing some fun open world content between instanced gameplay sessions like Lost Ark, well, we'll have to wait and see. Honestly, the point of this was just a thought that arose. What the hell is an MMO today? We have a sense of tribalism and community that comes from being an MMO player, but that term is almost worthless in a genre that has become far more broad. Take the news of Tower of Fantasy and Throne and Liberty there recently. They're both called MMORPGs, but you absolutely have no idea how they're going to play until you watch the gameplay trailer, and even that doesn't always help. Take Tower of Fantasy, it's basically a more involved Genshin Impact, but in a shared world, with global world bosses and content, and of course, plenty of gacha. Throne and Liberty, given its length of development, does look more like an older MMO with some more modern sensibilities. A massive amount of players doing stuff together, hard group PvE, open world PvP, exploration with others, and all of that, but of course with modern visuals and action combat. Both games look great enough, and they're both clearly MMOs in the literal sense. But there was a heavy moment of doubt before actually checking them out to see if they would fit the bill. Basically, nowadays calling something an MMO is really not that useful whatsoever because the entire industry has attempted to move to that direction, and I think there's many reasons why. A lot of them are obvious to us. Of course, when someone says MMO, you'll probably think of something that asks for a hell of a lot of time and has a gearing or item level loop, which brings us to a very fun exploration. So here are 4 games that range from considered an MMO, to marketing calls it an MMO but nobody else does, to no one would dare call this an MMO but they could sort of get away with it. So first, Lost Ark. No one would challenge the categorization. MMO players play it, MMO websites and channels cover it, and you spend a large portion of the game running around a shared world doing stuff with other players. But the major focus and main point of the game is the grinding loop of instanced content, 4 to 8 players, which is far from massively and brings it closer to something like Destiny in reality. And remember, only 60% of the votes in that poll thought Destiny was an MMO. But clearly something has changed because everyone is happy to call Lost Ark 1. Then there's Diablo Immortal. It's actually not that far removed from Lost Ark, right? I mean, it borrows heavily with it from things like the Heliquary, Platinum, and seeing other players do their business in the world around you. I don't know about you, but despite it seemingly qualifying as an MMO, it feels just a little bit off to call it one, right? It just doesn't have the vibe. Maybe that's because it's a Diablo game and they are just not called MMOs by most. It's weird. Blizzard call it an MMO, but I basically have never heard another person say Diablo Immortal is an MMO. Now, the obvious link from Immortal is Path of Exile. If Immortal qualifies as an MMO because Lost Ark qualifies as an MMO, then Path of Exile should 99% qualify too. You've got global chat, you see other players in the shared hubs, and you don't really interact that much with them, and you don't actually see them in the gameplay areas. You do content alone or in a small group, but you do exist in a shared community, and you get those social interactions in the hubs. It's a minuscule enough difference, and it's one that doesn't really feel like it matters. But thankfully, we've actually got a lot of words from the developers about why they hate being called an MMO, even before the game launched. This 2,400-word forum post basically boils down to, Path of Exile is not an MMORPG, it's an online action RPG. Saying they want to be distanced from the MMORPG term, applying of course to WoW clones at the time, and saying it would be a major technical risk to make the game support more players per area and require more players as a result of that. There were also tidbits about instances allowing randomness that Chris Wilson, the lead at Grinding Gear Games who wrote the post, actually reiterated almost 12 years later, just a few weeks ago, when he was talking to Josh Strife Hayes. Basically, being a traditional MMO limited them too much, so they decided not to be one. Although it's worth noting that Chris didn't object to Josh calling Path of Exile an MMO in that interview, so maybe they're happier with it now, and maybe that's because the definition has changed. What's acceptably an MMO has changed. The takeaway here is, it isn't an MMO, but it falls under the same blanket now that the genre is different. And maybe it's less about genre, and it's more about potential player base. Now, our final example might raise some eyebrows, but I'm doing this to make a point. Monster Hunter is basically a tiny step away from this modern definition of an MMO. There's no shared world, it's session-based only, but it has every other bit of what a action MMO sort of gameplay thing would be. Instanced, session-based boss battles that are solo or multiplayer, allowing a long-tail progression with regular live updates and crafted gear loops that last for months. The only thing it's missing to fit with Destiny and Warframe is just a shared hub where you see other players, and I guess there, slap it on, now we call it an MMO. And the question I want to ask you today is, does that really matter? When the MMO genre has largely become about the flavor of PvE or PvP content and a satisfying gearing loop to keep playing, does the massively part actually matter when you are playing the game? And that's the thing. Even look at World of Warcraft. In modern days, World of Warcraft has become less of an MMO, more, as Chris would put it, of an online action role-playing game. Because so much of what you do in WoW, ultimately for so many of its players, involves session-based, instanced combat. So I think that the MMO term has become basically useless. And for you, presumably you're an MMO player, I think that means it's worth thinking about what part of the MMO genre you actually like. And maybe us working out how to describe it in a different way so that when we say MMO or whatever the replacement is, it actually refers to the sorts of games that we want to play. And that's why I mentioned Ashes of Creation at the very top of this video. I think it's the sort of MMO that right now the MMO label isn't particularly covering for that many people, and I think that's why they are so goddamn excited. So yeah, what do you think? Is the MMO genre label still useful to you, or has it become something different? Has what the modern market makes become something different? Would you rather create your own fun in a big shared world with other players, or would you rather a more Destiny-like experience or a WoW Mythic Plus-like experience where, yeah, sure, there's a big world or whatever, but I'm kind of here for my gameplay and my gearing loop, don't care about that other stuff. I think it's a little bit more of a subculture around MMO players, and I think that's honestly where a lot of drama and disagreement comes from. From mixed expectations, a breakdown of communication, because the meaning of MMO is broken down. Food for thought. Anyway, we have more videos on this channel coming up ASAP covering some games that you'll expect, maybe even a few games that you won't expect. So stay tuned and let me know, what the hell does MMO even mean to you?